Right. And we wanted to welcome you to the OPAL Senior Center. OPAL is an acronym, stand for Online Programming for Adult Learners. So today we welcome Miss Cassie Kilroy Thompson. I'm going to introduce her in a second, but if you don't know me, please allow me to take this moment. I am Chastity Weiner. I am the director of the Opal Senior Center. So it's so good to be among you. And Cassie is with us today. She is a dynamic combination of being native Marylander, a historian, a storyteller, an educator, and a data detective. She uses family collections and government records, historical newspapers, and more just to create this narrative and bring it to you today. She has many interesting things to share and that she has learned about the village of Texas in Baltimore County. You may have already heard about this town of Texas when we took our Quarryville or our Quarry a tour to Texas, Maryland. It's the Martin Marietta Quarry in Texas, but it's right in Cockeysville, and there's a history about that too. So, Cassie, I'd like to turn it on to you so that way you can teach us a little bit more about that from the mid 1800s to the current day. Oh, one more thing. Please feel free to go ahead and turn on your video camera if you've ever facilitated. Oh my goodness, it is tough talking to black boxes because we are largely nonverbal folks. So our stature, our eyes looking inquisitively, we're all interpreting that. So if you feel comfortable, we would love that. So Cassie, please, hello and welcome.
Well, thank you. One of the things I usually do, largely because of my own hearing loss, I usually have captioning on, but for some reason, Zoom never wants to show me captioning. I don't know why. It's like I flip it on and off and it's still not doing anything. So it just constantly says it's listening.
There
Well,
you
listen,
go. I
the
just turned it
part that
on.
says it's listening is actually the slideshow that PowerPoint will listen and caption. So I have a feeling it's competing with Zoom and that they don't like each other for some reason. So if anybody is having any trouble hearing, please let me know because sometimes I do. And as Chastity said, my name is Cassie Kilroy Thompson. I was born in what was called Texas, Maryland at one time, but became Cockeysville by the time I was living there, and learned a lot about Texas from my father, who grew up on the railroad tracks in Texas, Maryland. My grandmother was the postmistress at Texas, Maryland, one of the last ones. She was 1948, and I think they closed that post office in 1950, and it became part of the Cockeysville post office at that point. So when we started looking at family tree information, I had a whole lot of really good information, but we attended St. Joseph's in Texas, and they always told everybody that all their records had burned up in a rectory fire. And I always say, whatever records you're looking for, they either burned up or they were in a flood, and or they didn't exist yet. But in this particular case, one of the things I sought to do was I had all this other alternate information that could take the place of some of those missing records, and people started sending things to me when we started using programs to keep track of families and whatnot, that they would send me things and I would have photos and whatnot. So there is a group that I founded called the Friends of Texas Maryland. We have a website, friendsoftexasmaryland.com, where I post newspaper articles and queries that people have asked, and I provide information, for those queries and try to keep it organized. But my full-time job is a disability specialist and assistant director at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And I'm sitting in my office at UMBC right now. And I mentioned to Chastity earlier that sometimes people will knock on my door, even though it says in a meeting on my door. but normally my door is unlocked and they just open my door unlocked just so I can go like this. So if I get distracted, you'll know that's what's going on in the background. So this background of this very first slide here is an old map, right? And on this map, there's all kinds of place names that are unfamiliar to those of us um, looking at this. But in between where it says the date and my name, you can see something that says Quarryville. And that was one of the names for that area at one time. It had lots of names. But Texas, Maryland is the one I grew up with and that I know the most about. And it's this cartoon where it says, Roger has an encyclopedic mind. Isn't he impressive? His specialty is geographic trivia. Did you know there's a part of Maryland called Texas? That's weird. I thought his specialty was knowing the stats of Marcus Clover, right? So somebody saw that, sent that to me, and I use that as a thing to say that there are people who know that Texas, Maryland exists, and there are people are surprised to know about it, right? And how this cartoonist that did this cartoon knew about it is beyond me. So, all right, see if I can make it advance. Here's the other part of the map. So it is, if you look at where Baltimore is and where you can see Towson on the screen, you keep going north and you'll see something that says Texas. And you'll notice that the little circle next to Texas is on the railroad. So that's the center of Texas. People who have not had the opportunity to go down that far because the road stops at the railroad now. It didn't used to. But on this 1856 map, it's showing where that sits on the North Central Railroad. Most of you probably know that the North Central Railroad tracks were abandoned at one point, but they became part of the light rail. And when they extended the light rail out further, they kind of changed the alignment to where that is. And so now you can no longer cross over down at the end of Church Lane in Texas. But at the time that a lot of this stuff was going on, that road continued on as Beaver Dam Road. Alrighty. And everybody has a story about how Texas got its name. The only definitive data that I could find was when it was adopted, right? The meeting that it was held at, they've been calling it Texas or Little Texas for a long time, but it was officially changed to have that post office in 1850. Simultaneous with that, there were Irishmen who returned from fighting in the Mexican War. And the stories are told that they thought it reminded them of Texas and the creek that runs down through their western run, they refer to as the Little Rio Grande. I have no clue whether any of those things are accurate, but there's a lot to be said for having lots of ways that it became. All right, so it appeared on lots of maps prior to the time that the post office was named, so it was in use. Here's an 1836 map where it said, this is the Texas Road. So that was certainly before that time. And you can see that some maps and things like this will have names on them, and that's always kind of fun if it's a name that you're looking for. Oh, by the way, when I'm done, even though I may not be able to get to all of the slides that I have here, I will share them with Chastity and she can send that out to anybody who requests to see the slides. All righty. So this is the specifically, people said, well, it was also called Ellengowan. Now, Ellengowan was the area that was Taylor's Hall. And if any of you know what Taylor's Hall is, it was the Cockey estate that was across from the railroad tracks. And there was a separate post office there that was also called Padonia Station, and that's where the name Padonia comes from. More about that in a minute. And this was that 1856 map that said Quarryville. Obviously, that's after the time that those other maps had Texas, right? And again, as Chastity mentioned earlier, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it, or you can post it. I think, I don't know, Chastity can tell you otherwise.
There is a
Um,
chat button, if I may. So feel
okay.
free to post it in the chat. Like I said, I am a little outnumbered, so I'll try to monitor the chat as best as I
Yeah,
can. But
but either
obviously,
way.
unmute yourself. That's probably the best.
Yeah. So at any rate, this is just showing that that area was called multiple things all at the same time. Where I grew up was where it's the Nesbits and where Galloway went up there, where the almshouse is now. And if you've been to a visit to the quarry, you can see all of that from the Texas quarry. And this was additional maps showing some of the names that we found. So you can see where the York Road is on the right-hand side, and the roads that are going to Texas Station, as it was referred to in this map. Um, and these maps, all of this information is all at the Historical Society of Baltimore County, because I was running out of room in my house. So it's called the Texas Collection. And there was Thomas Ward, who had an estate a little further out, but had a connecting road that went to Texas as well. And one additional property owner in that area was George Iverson. So in 1877, the Hopkins map, which if any of you've seen the Hopkins maps, there are a lot of them, a lot of pages in that book for Baltimore County. And it always had a little bit of advertising on the page. It says 9th district on this. That's an error. This is the 8th district, but this is the original map that was there. So you can see a little bit about where the poorhouse, as it's labeled here, is, and the Nesbit estate. And then Miss Annie Nesbit, closer to the York Road, was a descendant of Judge Alexander Nesbit. And then all the property that became Texas, Maryland was owned by the Cockey Owings family, one of whom was married to Judge Alexander Nesbit. You can also see the Padian name, which is where Taylor's Hall was. Richard Padian's family bought it from the Cockeys. Richard Padian escaped the famine, is the way the story is told in Ireland, in a townland called Ballykilcline. And that's how I ended up connecting with a lot of the people that were involved, is that I knew all those names and I knew where they were. And they were trying to locate what happened to all the people that were evicted from that part of Ireland. And they were on the other side of the railroad, and that building has long since been moved to Rockland, or Brooklynville, as it's sometimes called. So this was like a close up of that center part of that map, which was what others have called Texas proper, right? And there were a lot of the names that were on there, and including members of my father's family. Where it says those lime kilns are, that's actually where my father's uncles, the Lindsays, and my grandfather's family, the Kilroys, had a place there. And this was a typical census return from 1860, and a lot of the names that are on these pages were names that I knew had come from that part of Ireland. And so the names that always stand out for me are the Kellys, the Hanleys. It says Caden, but that's actually the Padians, and Connors, and it's yeah, some of these other ones I think there's Thomas Kilroy, but it looks like it says something else. and quite a few others that were on here. And some of those names become um, engraved in history because of things that their descendants often did. The group in Ireland, these were the surnames that were the families that were evicted from that part of Ireland. And what's unique about these people was that many of the records in Ireland burned up in the Easter Rising in 1916 in Ireland. But the records for Ballykilcline happened to be in London at the time. And a man named Robert Scally, who my ancestors from the area were named Scally, no relation to him, apparently. He wrote a book about it called The End of Hidden Ireland. Um, and so those of us involved were looking to see where did these people go. And many of these names appear in Texas, Maryland. And I'm going to screw up the relationship here, but the Mary, I mean, Jane Covahay was my immigrant ancestor that married Thomas Scally, and her sister Maria married Michael Kenny. And so all the Kennys that appear in Texas, Maryland, were related to all of those people. And so as far as we can tell, Mary died in Ireland, and the Kenny family came to Texas, Maryland. And some of you may have heard the Covahay name before because they're attorneys in the Towson area. And I went to school with one of them and never knew that he was my second cousin once removed until I found these records. Let's see. So this is just a photo of Taylor's Hall, and it's in the left-hand side of the picture is the boundary stone. That boundary stone is no longer where it used to be. It is now at the Baltimore County Historical Society, the Alms House in Texas/Cockeysville. But these photos of the buildings there were done by Aubrey Boating, and those are maintained by the family. You can see part of that building was a log home, and they kept telescoping it and adding on to it. And why the Cockey family decided to part with it is beyond me. This is just a couple of photos of the quarries themselves and some articles from like geology magazines. And so some of the workers are shown in that center photo and looking down into the depths of the quarry. This would have been in probably around the 1950s on the right-hand photo. And for those of you who ever went swimming in Beaver Dam Quarry, there's a picture of the diving platform. That's where I learned how to swim. This was another aerial view from the 1950s of the quarry. When we were looking at that map before, and I was talking about where the lime kilns were, they were to the lower right of this in this photo. And that one house that's almost on the railroad tracks is the house that my father grew up in. And story was that the way my father learned how to swim was his two older brothers shoved him over the cliff into the quarry, and he learned how to swim that way. I believe it. He was a good swimmer. And here's the other quarry that was next to that, which was called Little Lindsay's or Kilroy's Quarry, because my grandmother inherited it in the 1940s. And these are pictures of the kilns as they were. There were two types of lime kilns, but they fell into disuse when there were cheaper ways of manufacturing agricultural lime than burning it in a lime kiln. The picture on the right, the color photo, was taken in, I'm thinking 2006, around then, and it was I could see those from the other side of the light rail. When it gets all overgrown, you can't see it, but in the wintertime when things start dying back. And this was on the opposite side of the railroad. From there was a place called Empire Furniture Company, which I had never heard of until I got a query from somebody who had furniture. And on the underside of the furniture, it said, manufactured by the Empire Furniture Company in Texas. And my dad was still alive at the time. And he said, yeah, that was across the way from Cappy Berlin's place. I'm like, where was that? So even though we grew up there and lived there, there was lots of things that to be learned from things that other people shared. This is the 1902 picture of St. Joseph's Church. That whole area is huge, huge now compared to what it was then. When I went to school there, that was the size of the church, but they quickly were adding on. And that was before the school was built. And we always would talk about that red front door. Monsignor scarf had to have everything bright red. There's a lot to be said about scarlet, as he said. This is a photo we have and a copy of the page from a book called The Diamond Jubilee of St. Joseph's Parish. And it was published in 1927, which was the year my dad was born. But my grandmother was actively involved in the production of that. And so she had an original copy that we have since copied, and copies reside at the Historical Society of Baltimore County. Of note on the page that I'm showing, it talks about the second Texas school. And it said that the principal was a man named Mr. Wickman. And there's a whole lot more information in there. But who Mr. Wickman was actually Louis Weichman, who was one of the people who testified against the Surratts in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And the story that was told during that trial was that Louis Weichman and John Surratt were tasked with bringing a letter to St. Joseph's to talk to Father Mahoney. And they stayed at Richard Padian's house in Texas in 1863. And rumors had abound that they were somehow complicit in a conspiracy of the Catholic Church to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, none of which was ever formally proven one way or another, but the rumor still persisted. They had a reunion of all classes in 1996 at St. Joseph's, and excuse me, I'm sorry. This photo is of the remaining people who could come from the earliest classes at the school. My father's class was a class of 1939. And he is the gentleman in the light blue jacket in the center in the background. And his name was Richard Kilroy. He went by Dick, and he's standing next to Dick Chilcote, and across the way from Dickie Covahay, whose name was not Richard, so I don't know where the nickname came from. And Mr. Covahay told me a story one time that they used to skip school, and they would go over to the baseball fields where a semi-pro team played, and the owner would give them money for ice cream if they would gather all the foul balls and everything. And unfortunately, this was after my father had passed away, so I couldn't get more information about the school skipping. So another famous resident from Texas was Colonel Harry Gilmore. He had a Texas regiment in the Confederacy, and there's lots of information about that is mentioned in lots of different parts of the history of the Civil War, including the fact that there was a priest named Abram Joseph, and he wrote a lot of poetry. Father Abram Ryan was his last name. He wrote a lot of poetry and published a lot of books about the Confederate. I think he contributed to the myth of the lost cause. But one of the poems that was published in that Jubilee was called To Katie, and it was written about Katie Padian, that house. And that's a photo of Father Abram Ryan. He was called the poet priest of the South, but he was never an official chaplain for the Confederate Army. I think he was a roving volunteer. And this is just more about that John Surratt's visit to there, and how the names that the book itself mentioned are incorrect. It was the 1927 Jubilee for St. Joseph was based on oral histories because, as I mentioned, the actual records burned up in a fire. So they did the best they could with spellings and who the people were. But I've had students here at UMBC who wanted to research that all of those connections, and nobody's ever quite gotten further. Actually, I became friends with the woman who used to do History Detectives, and she wanted to do a show about it right after they decided that they were going to change the format of History Detectives. So it didn't happen. And these are just some of the pages of the transcripts from the trial of John Surratt, and all the places. They all alternated between calling it Little Texas, Ellen Gowan, and Texas Station. All right. Oops. Why is it not moving? There we go. There's additional information. When you get a copy of the slides, you can look these things up to know more about the conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln. This was a house that was on the corner of basically just past, if you knew anything about Texas, where McDermott's Bar was, and before the end of the Railroad Avenue where my dad lived. And it was the Poe Burns house. And so there's lots of information about these buildings because they were all photographed during the historic architectural building survey. This was the almshouse as it looked in 1907. They subsequently had a fire as well, and it was reconstructed. So the front part of the building was only 2 stories high because that third and fourth stories posed a lot of problems during that fire. The Chilcote family, for many years, one of the Chilcotes were the administrators at the almshouse, took care of the farm that was up there on the hill. And this is a photo of the Chilcote family from 1907. And this is what the almshouse looks like from the front and side at this point. Those porticos that are on the side are still there. And then there's more photos of all the buildings that were there from the Historic American Buildings Survey on the Library of Congress website. So where that building was, that was the Empire Furniture Company, became the Pool Engineering Munition Plants. And this is just one page from a book that I found where it talks about how much business that they were doing there and creating munitions for the war. My favorite picture of all time is this, the picture of the 1934 Texas baseball team. I have no idea whether there were, it seems to me that there were 2 Texas baseball teams because in all my research, I found multiple things going on at the same time. Some of the names of the people that were written on there by the person who sent this to me's father, right, were Bussy. I have to move something out of my way here. Let me see. Keyes, Walker, McDermott, Perry, Poe, Miller, Ford, Kugel, Turnbull, Thompson, and there was something, it looked like it said LMAN, and we're not really sure who that was. Maybe it was somebody named Ullman or Coleman. We don't know. But the thing that fascinated me is growing up on Gibbons Boulevard, we always were told that the baseball field we played on used to be from a semi-pro team, and we didn't believe it, but where this photo appears to be taken is in that exact spot, facing up to where the almshouse is. The little blue line on the right-hand side there is pointing to the almshouse. And so all those kids who were older than me at the time who said that probably were repeating things, but who knows? So here's another picture of that Burns Poe house, two different versions of it. A priest by the name of Kevin Mueller went around taking a lot of railroad pictures, and that's where some of the color ones came from. Sometimes it wants me to move, and that's just a bigger one of that. And here's another one facing north on Railroad Avenue, and you can see how old this picture is because there's an old car there. And this was taken in the 1950s. It's as if you walked out of St. Joseph's Church, headed down towards the railroad tracks, and took a photo. At the time when I was in school there, every day when they would blast in the quarry, we had to put our heads down on our desk, and then there was always quarry dust everywhere. And you can see they were trying to clean the street of the quarry dust at the time. It doesn't look like that anymore. And here's some other photos about the intersection at Church Lane and York Road. Traffic from Church, where people had to get out of the car, and direct traffic to get people out from church, and people that owned the tavern on the corner there, and it was called the Star Hotel at that point. And then we later had the change in names. Let me see if this is going the right direction. So at any rate, these are some of the other older buildings that were there. It was the Thomas Ward House is the one on the right-hand side there. And that building is long gone now. And this was the McDermott's Tavern. This is after they had closed. And these photos were taken by that building survey. But as kids, we always knew that was not a place we were supposed to go to, but there were a lot of people who did. These two photos were taken at the Star Hotel at the other end of the street. And we've heard from a lot from the families of people who were involved with that. And then it's called the Stable now. So, and this was pictures of houses at Gibbons Boulevard, New York Road, where I grew up. And this one was the Ellengowan, the house. It was called Ellengowan, that one that had all the white on it previously, but by the time this came around, it was a completely different look. And then the postmasters that were at these various places listed were a lot of those family names appear in a lot of the research that we're doing. And Mary A. Kilroy there, that's my grandmother. And I mentioned already about the Jubilee book, that I had some of those pages from it. And again, some of these records and the lists of the family names are on my website at thefriendsofTexasMaryland.com. This was really going slow. This is my grandmother's family. My grandmother's mother was a Scally, and the picture in the center is my grandmother as a young girl, and her mother, both her mother and her father died. They lived in St. Louis, and her father died in 1902. They moved back to Texas, Maryland, and her mother died in 1906. So she was raised by Mary Scally's parents and family, the Patrick and Annie Cummings Scally, that are on the left-hand side there. And on the right-hand side is a picture of my grandmother when she married my grandfather, Joseph Michael Kilroy, at St. Joseph's Church. And this is a picture of her and the kids after her husband died in 1932. And then my father and his siblings with my grandmother in 1968. in that photo. Just a couple of more slides, and then I'm going to be ready to take questions. Okay, these are some of the photos that people that are related to the families. Pardon me. Um, and they would send these and tell me who they are. And if you go to either our Facebook group, which is called the Friends of Texas Maryland, or if you go to the friendsofTexasMaryland.com website, you can see these photos there, and people have commented about who the people are in them, and as well as other information. And then this last is a list of those websites. This slide is old and it says friendsofTexasMaryland.org. Somebody stole my website and it's now friendsofTexasMaryland.com. But all the other things are still functional the way they are. And I still receive email at friendsofTexasMaryland@umbc.edu. And then finally, this is a story about Canada mints. I don't know how many of you know what Canada mints are, but everybody I know who grew up in Texas always had a story about Canada mints. And my dad always kept them in a jar on his counter in the kitchen or in his car many, many years later. And as it turns out, when we had a discussion about it, my uncle did the same thing. And finally, my dad tells us that people had those in their pocket because they would be smoking and they didn't want to smell like cigarettes. And lo and behold, I find an ad that says for after smoking. He said that the woman who helped take care of them after his father died when they were all little always kept them in her pocket. And one of the kids would start crying, she'd give them a mint. And so they all developed this Canada mint habit, as we like to call it. And lots of people have told me stories about the same thing was true in their families. So you never know when something insignificant like a jar of Canada mint sitting on the counter would come up with information that we didn't have before. So I'm going to go back to the slide before that and have that up there. But if anybody has questions and they would like to ask them, I'm happy to answer them. And I'm trying to look and see
Yeah.
if Chassie,
Yep.
Chassie, are you around?
I am. And I invite anyone just to take yourself off of mute if you're able to, or drop it into the chat. You might want to give them a few minutes if they're typing.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm not going anywhere. And the phone, when my phone started ringing, it was my husband, the one person who doesn't have access to my work calendar.
Did everyone know this great history? I always knew Cockeysville as Cockeysville, never Texas, and that it was once again born on the backs of immigrants in the area. We kind of take that
And
for
it
granted.
went from being people famously, it said only Irish need apply, which is exactly the opposite of what would happen in cities when the Irish immigration was happening. But in Texas, eventually that got replaced by, not replaced by, added on to by German and Italian immigrants because they were working a lot with both the limestone and the marble that were coming out of those quarries. And some of the that marble was used for the porticos at the Capitol in DC, St. Patrick's Church in New York, the Washington Monument. And those of you who know the Washington Monument know that there's two different colors of marble that was used. And the upper portion of that was the Texas marble. And there's lots of different stories related to the provision of that marble. And I was at an event in Baltimore last year where they were talking about the City Hall, the marble in the front of City Hall in Baltimore was all that marble was also from Texas, Maryland, which I hadn't really known. but the people that they said owned the quarries are not the people that I have records for that own them. And I think it involved management and leasing and things like that. It was probably a big legal mumbo jumbo.
Well, and don't forget the Baltimore Stoops as well.
Yep. Yep. The marble stoops. When I lived in Indiana, there was a marble quarry behind the house that we lived in, and everybody went swimming there. And its claim to fame has nothing to do with where that marble went, had everything to do with the fact that that's where they filmed the movie Breaking Away about the bike race in Bloomington, Indiana. And of course, then when people came to visit my husband and I when we were living there, they all wanted to go to the quarry. And it's just like, okay, yeah, we're here too, by the way. But they
Do
wanted to
you,
see where the movie was filmed.
so Cassie, do you feel that because there was a little bit more of a tolerance of Irish immigrants as opposed to other parts of the nation um, that Texas at the time was even like it was a haven, if you will?
Yeah. And it was different because many of the Irish would come into, let's say, into the Baltimore port, and they would find other Irish that were in the city, and they would work for, the railroad, the B&O. And that's where the Irish American Museum is. It's called Irish History Museum, is in near the B&O Museum. Used to be called the Irish Shrine, and at least that's what we refer to it as. And I give a talk there usually once a year. This year it's going to be around Labor Day because, as it would have it, my dad grew up next to the railroad tracks, but then he went to work for the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he was a telegrapher, sent messages by telegraph from the Bowie Tower, and ultimately became the general chairman of the local union and became the vice president of the telegraphers union, which merged with another union. And that's how we ended up in the Midwest, where the other union was. And he became the president of the Brotherhood of Railway and Airline Clerks in 1990, no, 1981. I'm just going to mess that one up. And he moved the offices back to Maryland. And he he became the founding president of the Transportation Trades Department for the AFL-CIO. And so he grew up on the tracks, didn't have a high school diploma, but he traveled all over the world talking to um, international transportation federations, and would be interviewed by Dan Rather and people like that. And those kinds of things don't really happen much anymore. But it's a Maryland labor story that we're hoping to get recorded as a podcast on the Maryland 250 website. And we're the the labor historians that are involved in that. And it's like in my spare time, I'm going to assist them with that. Any questions?
Yeah, there's two from Anita in the
Okay.
chat. There's two parts. Do you do a program on Warren too? And then did they move the product by train?
They did move the marble by train, and they also moved the crushed limestone, which is why all the lime kilns are located along the North Central Railroad, because they had to be then transported from the railroad up to the top of the hill, because those perpetual kilns, they would put it in at the top of where the fire was already burning down below, and then they would rake out the agricultural lime from after it was pulverized due to the high heat in those lime kilns. But we found a few photos of like large pieces being transported on the railroad. And the fascinating thing about the North Central Railroad is when it went into Baltimore, it went by a lot of places along the Jones Falls. And so there was a lot of industry that was already there in Baltimore. And many of the Irish who lived in Texas ultimately ended up on the North Central Railroad on a commuter car and moved into Baltimore, whereas the particular Irish in my family came in through New York and went straight to Texas, Maryland, because there were people that they knew that were already there and they had jobs. And there were two other places in the country where a lot of them went to, and one was Rutland, Vermont, which was a company marble company town, and LaSalle County, Illinois, another company owned set of quarries that were in LaSalle County, Illinois. And we, trying to figure out who was the first person there. Well, I went there because my friends were there. Why were your friends there? Looking at the stories. And I believe it was the Hanley family in Texas, Maryland. They were there, I think, in advance of everybody else. And they must have known somebody that wrote, because not all of them could read and write, that were sending word back to Ireland, where to come when you can get transportation. So, but it was just unusual because it wasn't a city, it wasn't an enclave within a city. It was basically they basically created the town.
Do you do a program on Warren too?
I do not, but I know the people that do because there's a lot of interaction between Warren and Ashland and Cockeysville in Texas. And one of the things that led me to was we never knew what happened to my great grandfather John Kilroy, who was born in County Mayo, Ireland, came with his parents around, we think, maybe 1866, 1867. And then they were living in Ashland. And when I found that record, I'm looking in Texas. I mean, there were Kilroys in Texas, right? And then my dad says, "Oh, yeah, the Kilroys had a place up in Ashland." Thanks, Dad. I've been looking in the wrong place this whole time. But what happened to them, right? And because they weren't there after 1880, we couldn't find them. And as it turns out, Michael Kilroy, my great great grandfather, was killed in 1896 on the tracks in Ashland, where he was doing track maintenance. And it was in the newspaper. I was able to find a newspaper article, and the family had the funeral from St. Anne's in Baltimore, and then the burial was in Texas, Maryland at St. Joseph's. So then I started finding a lot of families who moved down to Baltimore. So it was the opposite direction that other people were taking. They would show up in Baltimore and they just moved to an area where there were a lot of Irish. But in the case of the families that I know about, it was the other way around, where they would go in there.
Well, that's all that I have here in the chat. Any last questions? Please unmute yourself or forever hold your peace, as they say.
Well,
But they
there are a lot of quarries in Cockeysville that are
also,
filled in with water now. Um,
Mhm.
the Beaver Dam is not the only one. And of course, you have the one at Oregon Ridge. You
Yep,
have others who filled with water because of the fact that it's very hard to keep ahead of the water when you're digging down that deep.
yep.
So,
And
so
Beaver Springs was the other big one up that way that had its
right,
own set of controversies.
right.
And and so the Lindsays and Kilroy's quarries, one of them is a storm retention pond now, but they were all purchased by Harry T. Campbell from all
Hmm.
the individual families, which is why that big Texas quarry got so big, is that the Enzers, I'm trying to remember all the family names, they all sold. And when my grandmother moved into Baltimore, she couldn't do anything with it anymore. And so they didn't quite know where the veins of limestone and where the veins of marble were going to end. So it just kept getting bigger and bigger. But by the time they put the Harrisburg Expressway in, that sort of became like, okay, this is now the limit, right? And we can imagine that underneath of Mays Chapel, there's probably, some veins of of marble there. The families who sold those quarries to Campbell's, of course, then subsequently saw Campbell's sell to, Rockland Genstar, and then before it was Martin Marietta, it was Lafarge, and then
Mhm.
Lafarge and Martin Marietta, and then now it's called Bluegrass, I think, but it's a subsidiary of Martin Marietta. And the fellow that does the tours and provides information for the tours. There's two tours coming up sponsored by the Historical Society. I think one is like May 11th, maybe. The other one is later, and I'm not going to remember. But if you go to the Historical Society of Baltimore County website, you can see those. But they usually fill up really fast because people are fascinated by a big hole in the ground that you can stand on top of a hill and look. And one time somebody said, well, if you're looking for the employment records, maybe if you go in there up by where the scales are and you go down to where the building is, that maybe somebody in there knows where the old employment records went. Well, not knowing that the road that they were sending me down was right through the middle of the quarry. I got down at the bottom and there's these massive pieces of equipment surrounding my minivan, and this was like 1991 maybe, and I turned around and hightailed it back up to the other end, and just the person who told me to do that probably wasn't thinking when they told me to drive down there. So one of these days I'm going to see if this fellow that's been doing these, because he works there, and he may know something more about the records that are there, because there were not only a lot of immigrants working there, but there were a lot of African American men that were working in the quarry, and the conditions, I'm sure, were not great on either end, and the types of diseases that happen with certain types of airborne particles probably were rampant. And the people that lived alongside those tracks or worked in there. My grandfather was a pump maintenance mechanic, so trying to get that water out was definitely a big deal. And as we know, when the some of them started to fill in and they gave up, there was equipment in there still, which made swimming to the depths dangerous for lots of people. And there's a lot of deaths that were noted, people that trespassed and went in when they weren't supposed to, which is it's really sad, but it's like part of being a kid, I guess.
Cassie, I think I heard someone else did
Anita,
anyone
do you have
else?
another question?
I think so. Kathy, did you have a question?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. My mother was the Covahay.
Oh, okay.
Her first cousin was the Towson lawyer.
Yeah.
She went to St. Joe's for 8 years. I have a sneaking suspicion somewhere along the line we connect.
Yeah, we probably do, because I've gotten a lot of the information from some of the relatives and everything, and some, like Mary Mix. I'm trying to
Yes.
think of her name. She was a Covahay. And in Ireland, they call it Cavati. My dad
Cavati,
always
yes.
said Cavatis. When we were growing up, he went to the liquor store. He said, I'm going to Cavatis, right? And I think that's the way his Irish people pronounced it. So when first time I went to Strokestown, where they lived, I asked the postman about it. And I showed him how it was spelled in a couple of ways, but I'm telling you, it's Covahey, no matter where you look, right? And everybody goes, well, are they related to the Conahies? Are they related to? No, they all live next door to each other. This was a totally separate name. And I remember standing there, and the guy who's the sexton at the church there in Strokestown, um, the postman sent me up to go talk to him. And the story is that he knew a man who was a Covahay who lived there when he was a kid. This guy was in his 80s. This was 2005. And the last Covahay there was the gameskeeper at the Strokestown Park Estate, which is now the Famine Museum in Ireland. And the house that he and his two sisters, who never married, lived in before they all passed, was at that point in time, it had just been torn down and they were putting in a bunch of townhouses in that location. And so I missed being able to see that house, but my understanding is part of Kathy's family may have come before that when the building was still standing, as this man, Billy Donlin, told us about people coming to visit. So,
Well,
A few, there's a,
Chastity recorded the tour of um quarry and it's on YouTube. The recording, so
okay,
you can watch that actually. And
okay,
also,
that's good to
a
know.
long time ago, they actually had a tour, and it was even before the one that's on Chastity has. That's that actually you can, if you go out and you type in the Beaver Dam Quarry, you'll be able to see that, and
Yeah.
that is amazing.
Yeah, the guy who's done all the drone views has also done a really, really good job. I just want somebody to take that drone and find those employment records, because it's just one more piece of evidence of who was working there and what happened with it. The same with I found a lot of records for the almshouse based on death certificates that were issued by one of the two doctors, Bussy, that were there when I volunteered to work at the Maryland Archives one summer, and they let me make copies of anything I wanted to, as long as I filled the vital records requests. So I was good pay for a volunteer to be able to get copies of those things, and they pretty much have had a lot of those death records digitized now. But at the time they weren't. You had to write to them, you had to send them money, and then I volunteered to help. It was just a happenstance kind of thing when I found out what it was, to be able to do that. But trying to find, people say, well, my great grandfather, he died at the almshouse. So where would he be buried? The only way we can do is if we can find that death record that says where they were buried. But my understanding was there was a pauper's field up there at some point that a lot of people were buried in. So
well,
that's
Cassie, I wanna thank you as we wrap it up. I do know Rob was intrigued with the Covahay connection. He did work at the Lutherville Fire Company, he said, in the 1980s, and the captain was Patrick Covahay. So, and then Kathy also wants to add, while you were talking about the connection, that she's also connected. That's her mom's brother. So, all good things. We know that this story certainly has far reaches, especially for Marylanders, a long time. And we want to thank you for sharing some of that history with us today.
anytime. And so I'm going to send Chastity these slides, and with the websites and things like that. And feel free to reach out. In my spare time, I look things up to see what I've got, what records I've given to the almshouse, and I'm happy to help. And I might be slow when work is really busy here at UMBC, but it's always a pleasure to try to connect things. And especially at the Coveys, because that was the defining thing for me in knowing that Jane Scally's maiden name was Covahay. It just made complete sense why Kate Kenny, who was a descendant of one, Kate Kenny, who hated children, consented to watch my father and his siblings one time, because it was a cousin. So at any rate, all right. Thank you all. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
the questions, and I look forward to hearing from people.
Thank
Take
you.
care.